Well, I want to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to EN224, American Literature 2. I am really excited to have you guys in this class. I'm sorry that I could not hang out with you our first day of class. For those of you who are signed up in the in-person section, I was sick and unable to be here, so I'm recording this video today, so you're going to be online students for this week. But I'm excited. I can't wait to walk through this course with you. There's a lot of exciting things in here. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of reading, and we're going to go over all of that today in this introduction. But I think that it will be an enjoyable experience for you. You're going to get a lot out of the class. So let's go over some of the basics of what's going to happen in this course, how it's structured. And then what I'm going to do is go over essential skills, essential tools that you need to succeed in a literature course. And so I want to kind of lay that out. I know a lot of you are at different levels. Some of you are taking this for a general education requirement. Maybe you've never taken a literature course before, or certainly not at the college level. Some of you are in our English program and are taking this course so that you can continue to build your skills, and you've done this kind of thing before. So some of this might be a little bit of a review for you, but I've added some new materials that I think that you'll get a lot out of. And then maybe some of you, this is a course that you're taking for personal enrichment. So you guys are here for a lot of different reasons. So I hope that you'll bring questions to next class if you have some of those as well, and let me know if there's anything that you don't understand, and I'd be happy to help. Online students who won't be in the in-person class next time, I would love to hear from you as often as possible because I don't get to see your faces in class. So please let me know if you have questions by sending me a message in Canvas or an email. My office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 4. Sometimes I'm in meetings, or sometimes I have other students who are in there. So please let me know ahead of time if you're coming, set up an appointment time with me. Otherwise, you may be waiting outside my door or something like that, and I want to make sure that I can serve you or get on the phone with you at the right time that you need. So please let me know about that. Well, let's go ahead and dive into the course structure, kind of syllabus thing, and then we'll look at our key tools for the study of literature. All right, so you can find the syllabus on the syllabus link here, or you can just click on the Files tab. Either way, I've got the syllabus right here, so I'll go ahead and download that. Make sure you do have a copy of the syllabus downloaded on your personal device, so you know what's going on in the class. All of our readings are posted here, as well as information about a lot of the assignments. So a lot of your questions can be answered directly in the syllabus, so make sure that you check out that if you haven't. If there are any changes that need to be made, I will update the syllabus accordingly. So you'll be able to see anything on there that may need to change. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this course. So first of all, it is American Literature 2, and what that simply means is that we start at the end of the American Civil War and then go through to the modern time period. That doesn't mean literary modern period. We technically go into postmodernism, but I mean our contemporary time period, our modern times is kind of where we head, okay? This course does not actually require currently any previous literature courses. I do intend to change that in the future, which is why I'm presenting to you a number of kind of some basic literary skills and tools that you'll need. This course will eventually change into kind of a more upper division literature course, but if you're in it for a general education elective, I am teaching it towards that at this cycle. So you get kind of an interesting hybrid course as we make some transitions. What we're going to study is all kinds of different types of literature in this time period: fiction, poetry, drama, novel. Now your book does contain some drama. We're really not going to spend a lot of time there. We may mention it. I don't think I've assigned any readings for you from the drama of the time period, just because we got to pick and choose, and we do only dip into one novel. There's just a lot to cover in this time period. This course also does not require that you've taken American Literature 1 prior to this. It certainly does help, but I'm going to review some of the content from American Literature 1 as far as history and literary timelines, so you kind of you can see where American Literature 2 fits in. I think context is incredibly important. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our objectives. In this course, you're going to improve your critical reading skills through critical analysis of literary texts. This is one of the main things that I want you to be able to get out of this course. Okay, and then you can see kind of at the end, you'll be able to critically read and analyze works from the American literature. Okay, and actually my wording here is wrong. This is actually for American Lit 1, so I apologize for that. But I want you to be able to get critical reading skills. Why is that important? Because it's important that you develop your critical reading skills to be able to engage with texts from any worldview so that you can provide answers for those who have criticisms of your worldview, for those who have questions of your worldview, and so that you can dismantle and take captive arguments that are against Christ. And secondly, you need good critical reading skills so that you can apply that to your own Bible study. And there's a lot of things that move from the study of literature to the study of the scriptures. A lot of similarities, and we'll talk about some of that in this course. Okay. Number 2, you will participate effectively in group discussions, emphasizing careful listening, critical thinking, and appropriate response. And we'll look at some of the assignments where you'll be doing that. In class students, you'll have a lot more direct group discussions, and then online students, you have kind of a slightly different way that you'll be doing discussions. I also want you to be able to develop the ability to research and write a literary essay. And we're going to focus a lot today on what that means, so stay tuned for that. Identify various cultural, linguistic, and sociological characteristics as presented in literary works. So literature is not just born in a vacuum. Literature, and including, by the way, the literature of the Bible, and whenever you hear me say the term literature of the Bible is both literary and it is true. So it is, when it's presenting history, it is true history, but it's presented in a literary way. Because God is beautiful and He's used the beauty of human language to communicate, which is really amazing. And it has a context, right? You learn that in your Bible courses. Same with human literature. It has a context. It was born out of a particular time period, culture, has different linguistic structures that are being used. So we'll learn some of those things in this course. And then you'll evaluate literary works according to a biblical worldview. You're going to read a lot of stuff in this course, and indeed your textbook has a lot of things in it that you are not going to agree with. You're going to be challenged in your thinking. You're going to encounter things that are objectionable, okay? And your job is to be able to read those in such a way that you can then analyze them from a biblical worldview, provide appropriate critiques from a biblical worldview, and learn to talk about difficult issues from a biblical worldview, okay? Now, I've tried to be careful to select some of the most appropriate works, and there are some things in your textbook that maybe are a little bit too sexually explicit or something like that. So we tried to take some care. But in literature courses, there is some content that you're going to get that is not from a biblical worldview, and you need to understand that. So we'll talk about how to navigate that, and you have assignments that are directing you to kind of think through those things as well, okay? So that's really important. Now, let's go ahead and break down what's required in this course. Of course, you do have a textbook. Looks something like this. And I had somebody ask me through email, which edition of the textbook do you need? You do need the first edition, the one that I have provided for you on the syllabus here. That is required. If you have any other kind of edition for the textbook, it will be different. Okay, there might be some similarities, but some of the readings that I assigned, at minimum, might just be that it shows you maybe different page numbers. But most likely is a lot of times editions change quite drastically. You're going to have completely different content. So be aware of that. That's incredibly important, that you do have the right edition. So edition 1. The other thing that's important is that you check this, that you have the correct volume. Volume 2 is 1865 to the present, okay? If you get volume 1, that's the one that we use for our American Literature 1 course, okay? And so you would be in definitely the wrong time period. So make sure you have the right book. Let me know if you have any questions. But you can see the costs out there. Of course, these costs do fluctuate quite a bit. I would manage to find a couple that were really cheap out there, so hopefully you're able to find some. And you might even be able to find some on campus. I haven't checked yet, but the Warrior Cafe may have one or two that are being sold here. So double check. If you have any questions on that, let me know. I do suggest in some way you find the MLA Handbook 8th edition. This is not a required resource for this course, but our papers are written in MLA format. Okay. And this may be new for you. If you've been in Calvary courses before, we just made a transition just this academic year, starting in the fall, where each department chooses the style guide appropriate for that department. We used to at Calvary use all the Turabian style guide, which is typically used within the Bible and theology department, and they still are using that style guide. And the English department, English and Communications department, uses the MLA style guide, Modern Language Association. Education uses the APA, I think, and our counseling courses use the APA. So there's a number of these style guides that are very different. And so you need to be aware of that. As I've been teaching this year, I've noticed that even though I mention this in class, mention it on the first day, mention it throughout the class period, I still get papers that are written in the wrong style. It's one of the most important things for you to think about as you're writing papers for your courses, that one of the first things that your professor sees is your ability to follow directions. So as you're writing a paper, make sure that you have the right style guide. Now, where can you find that? Well, the MLA style guide is relatively inexpensive. So option one is you could buy a copy. You can find copies available online. Make sure you do have the 8th edition. But if you don't want to spend extra money, and I would understand if you don't, you have a couple of other options available to you. Okay? So first of all, I absolutely love the OWL Purdue Online Writing Lab at Purdue University for MLA. Now, what is this? It is kind of strange for me to send you to another university's website, but the Online Writing Lab at Purdue University has been around for a very long time. It has been producing high quality content in the area of writing for many years. It was one of the first online writing labs out there, and just simply the best. Okay, what they have is they basically have the entire MLA style guide online, updated, basically in real time, and so you can actually see at the end of this article, if I scroll down to the bottom, this one actually doesn't have it, but oftentimes they'll tell you when this was last updated, and sometimes it's like that morning. So it's free, and it provides. And by the way, they also have APA 7th edition. They have a couple of other style guides here as well. Chicago is close to Turabian, but there's some significant differences. So I would not recommend using this for a class that requires Turabian. But for MLA and APA, this is fantastic. So this is updated to the 8th edition MLA, and it provides you with all kinds of information on the format that you can read. I always recommend students go to the sample paper first. The sample paper is a really quick way to understand what it looks like, and to even kind of use this as a template in guiding how you construct your papers. Okay, I'll go over this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the research paper a little bit later on in today's class, but I wanted to make you aware of the OWL Purdue MLA section. Okay, so that's one of the resources available to you. What else could you use as you're looking for various ways to connect to MLA resources? Well, our library here on Calvary's campus has at least one copy of the MLA Style Guide 8th edition that you can go. You can't check it out from the library. It's on reference. What that means is that you can check it out for about 2 hours at a time and just read it there in the library and use it as a reference. If you're not on campus, then you're probably going to want to use the OWL Purdue website that we just visited. Okay. And then finally, you can connect with the folks over at the Clark Academic Center. They also, I believe, have a copy of the MLA style guide that you can take a look at, but the tutors are also working through that style. They understand that our students need that, and so they can help answer questions. And if they don't know the answer, they'll find out the answer for you. So if you want to email them, if you want to call over there, if you want to set up an appointment just to help, if you've never done MLA before, you can do that as well. And then the next layer to that is they're in the process of putting online, and it may actually be there. I haven't actually checked their website yet, but the Clark Academic Center students have just put together our own MLA style guide. Okay, and it's basically a slimmed down version of the style guide, presented in like a sample paper format with annotations that kind of show you what to do and answer some basic questions. So that's a handy tool that we've developed here at Calvary University, and that should be available soon. I imagine if you don't see it on their website, and again, I forgot to check this morning, but if you don't see it on their website, you might email over there and see if they have that, because I know we finished the editing process of it last semester. That's a fantastic resource. Okay, so if you have any other questions about MLA, do let me know. So let's look at the other requirements for this class. We do have a discussion board. Okay, you may have used discussion boards in your other classes, so this will not be super new to you unless you've never done that before. Essentially, there will be a prompt that I give in class. And what I like to do in class normally is I like the students to select the prompt. So if there's something that we are really interested in studying together, and we want to know more information about it, and it's like, man, like we had a good in-class discussion, but we didn't get enough of that. I want you to be able to select that. Of course, today, since I've got no one in the physical classroom, I'll choose a discussion question. And usually I won't post those online, like you won't see the actual prompt, you'll just have a discussion board. So you've got to watch through this video. I usually give them at the end, we discuss them at the end. It'll be pretty obvious, and then I'm like, all right, here's what it is, and go and do that, okay? So watch for that today. And if in some random situation I forget, which is more common than I'd like to admit, please let me know, and I'll make sure that I supply that for you. So we'll have discussion boards. I do ask that your response be a minimum of 500 words. So that means you need to clearly think through this. You need to be well organized. This is an extension of the material that we go over in class and an extension of your reading. So your answers need to be well supported with notes, quotes from the text, and maybe even some outside research, though that's not required. And then I ask that you engage your peers in meaningful discussion after posting your initial response. So let me be clear about this. Number one, make sure that your responses are clear and well organized and well detailed. Okay? These are not just casual remarks like, yeah, I agree, yeah, I disagree. These are basically short essays. Okay? And I realize that you have a lot of work, but this course requires 135 hours worth of content that we squeeze into 8 weeks. So this is something you need to dedicate each week that you spend time doing, coming up with your responses and engaging in meaningful discussion with your peers. So what does meaningful discussion look like? Well, there's no length requirement. There's no number of posts that are required. But here's what I recommend. In engaging with peers, read their answers, and you can A, agree with somebody. Okay, and here's what that looks like. Hey, I really agree. I really like what you've said here because X, Y, and Z. It reminds me of this. And so you give kind of maybe a 2 to 3 sentence or perhaps a little bit longer reply to somebody. Don't just say, I agree or good job. That's unhelpful. And that really doesn't move the conversation forward in a meaningful way. But if you talk about what you agree with in specifics, maybe even offer more information, that's really helpful, and that can extend the learning in the classroom. Okay? I also take courses here at Calvary University. I'm getting a second master's degree in Bible and theology. Love our program here. And I was just doing a discussion board with one of my classes that just finished. And I was the only one doing the discussions, and I was getting really frustrated. I was like, how can I pull things out of other people? So I was randomly disagreeing with people and asking challenging questions and stuff, and finally got a good discussion going. And it really challenged me because then people start to challenge my positions, and I have to go and do some extra research. So I like that. I want to learn more, and this is a way to do that. So take advantage of this as you're in this course to learn the material. So if you agree, and here's what I did in the discussion board, if I agree with somebody, what I try to do is I try to add value as I agree. So I'm like, I agree with this portion of what you're saying here. In fact, here's an article that I found that's related to what you're talking about. So I can pull in outside research. Of course, I say here, that's not required. So you can also say, it reminds me of what I talked about in my post, and you can just kind of review what you talked about. So you're kind of recycling some of that content a little bit, and that might get them to read what you wrote, okay? And they can interact with that as well. And in fact, I even did that a number of times. I said, here's what I said. I'd love to get your feedback on what I wrote. And so you're inviting somebody in conversation with you. Okay, so you can agree with somebody. What else could you do? You could disagree, right? And you could do both. You could say, I agree with this, but I disagree with this. Now, when you disagree, of course, be nice, okay? But also, disagree and give specifics. So you're giving a counter argument. It doesn't have to be 500 words of a counter argument, though you're welcome to do that, okay? But give specifics, maybe attach an article, maybe provide some additional evidence of some kind, and then keep the discussion going. Try to even ask some open-ended questions. So, well, this scholar says this. What do you think about that? Okay, so you're moving the conversation forward. Even if there's something that you find that you just think, wow, this is a cool extra resource that I want to contribute to the discussion, then by all means throw that in. So this is an opportunity for us to dig deeper. So take the discussion board seriously and do craft well-reasoned responses, 500-word minimum, and have a good discussion with your peers. All right, so next, reading assignments and journals. So I say here that this course has about 100 plus pages of reading per week. I have reduced that. It's probably not 100 plus per week. The original draft of this course was, and as you guys saw, there was reading TBA for a long time because I was working with some of the other faculty and trying to navigate, and as you guys have seen in assembly and things recently, faculty are still trying to figure out how do we navigate teaching our content areas within an 8-week time period. Okay, and so one of the decisions that I thought I would try out in this course is I was going to focus on some more specific stories, and instead of trying to make you read wide, we're going to read deep, and I'm going to talk about how to read deep in today's class. So I've selected fewer readings for us, and there is of course a lot of material in this book that we have to skip over, unfortunately, but that does reduce your reading load a little bit so that you can read deeper. And so I'd love your feedback about that as we go through it. There certainly is a lot of reading in this course, and you need to know that. And I do expect that you read things deeply. And I've created some assignments to help you with that. The discussion board is one of them, but also you do have assigned readings, which we'll see below. You complete the assigned reading, and note, you should not be using any kind of outside substitute for reading. So no summaries on Cliff Notes, eNotes, or anything else, Schmoop, or any of those things, right? Read the actual assigned readings. You will certify that you have completed your readings in Canvas. I'll ask you what % that you've done. But then I also ask you each week to reflect on your assigned reading in your weekly reading journal. So what's that? Let's go to Canvas and let's take a look. If you click on the Assignments tab, that's one place that you can find it. And I like to organize by type. And we'll minimize projects and participation for now. I already talked about discussion boards. So here's reading. Okay, so let's take a look at Reading Journal 1 here. All right, all of the prompts are the same. Okay, so you're always going to be reflecting on this week's reading, excuse me, in at least 100 words. All right, so this is not super long, and I know some of you are word people, and you're going to have a lot to say, and 100 words is not much to be able to cover the amount of reading that you're doing. So you do have to kind of narrow yourself here. The discussion board does require a lot of writing. This one, I want you to kind of focus, okay? So notice, it says don't try to cover every single part of your reading. Instead, detail your reactions to a single text, perhaps. So maybe one story, or maybe two poems or 2 stories. But the goal is for you to interact with your reading on a gut level and prepare for discussion, and analysis. Here are some questions to help you think through what to talk about if you're really struggling. You don't have to talk about these. You don't have to talk about all of these. This is a recommendation. Okay, how did this text make you feel? I mean, you could write 100 words just on that. Sometimes, you read something, you're like, this made me feel gross. Okay, and you have 100 words to talk about that. What surprised you or stood out to you? Does the text remind you of something else that you have read, which, by the way, does happen in literature a lot, and you need to be engaging with that. That's a really big question we'll see in this class. Does this text remind you of your own life and observations? What literary elements did you notice? What effect did they have on the text? So there's a lot of information in here that you could cover in way more than 100 words. This is just a place for you to interact with the reading a little bit and dig deeper. Students have often found in the past with these types of assignments that it's helpful to even struggle through the text from a biblical worldview, especially if there's a text that you're reading that is a challenge, maybe that's hard to understand, or that it is a reading that's like anti-God, and this is the writer's view of like we should live the nihilistic life, or whatever. Then deal with that here. This is a way to kind of work through that discussion. Okay, how are you graded? You're graded on writing meaningful and thoughtful reflections. Okay. Demonstrating knowledge and understanding of the reading, and of course following directions, meaning that you are actually doing this. You're not writing about what you ate for breakfast today. It's not that kind of journal. Okay, it's not a Dear Diary. Don't tell me about your love life. It is a reading journal. Okay, hopefully that is clear. Let me know if you have any questions on that though. All right, what else? Participation. All right, so here's an opportunity for both our in-class students and our online students to be able to participate in the class. During the lecture, I'll provide you a series of activities which should be completed as directed and submitted on Canvas, okay? And I don't post those anywhere. I don't have a list of them. In fact, some of them I come up with on the spot as I realize, ooh, we need to focus in on something in a little bit more detail, or I don't know if this part is a struggle for students, so let's go ahead and do an activity, okay? I've done this kind of thing a lot in my classes, and it really helps us to engage in the material. But inevitably, I get somebody send me an email and saying, can you give me the list of all the participation activities you did in class? No. That's why you watch the video. You watch the video, you do the activities with us live as we're doing them. So online students, as you're watching our video and I say, all right, participation activity, you stop what you're doing and you get ready to write along with us, or you get ready to do whatever the activity is along with us, okay? So this is not a course that's easy to watch while you're doing the dishes or playing video games or something like that. You really have to kind of today's class would be, because it's a lot of me blabbing about the syllabus and stuff. But on normal classes, we pause a lot and do activities like, hey, let's take a moment to look at the setting in this story. I want you to imagine the setting. I want you to really engage your imagination. Describe what you're seeing, what the characters might be feeling in this situation. Okay. And in any given class, you may have 5 or 6 different participation activities. It completely varies from class to class. Okay. So you've got to pay attention, and you have to be active and ready to do those activities. I'll tell you what the guidelines are. There are many different types of activities that I've given. In some way, you need to demonstrate that you have completed the activity. Okay? So if you have like a notebook that you like to take notes longhand and do the activities longhand, take a picture of it with your phone and then upload that to Canvas. Here's where you turn those in. Again, back to the Assignments tab. And then Participation. Here's week 1 participation. Okay, so note it says follow the directions in the video to earn points for this week's participation. So whatever you do in class, whatever I've assigned, this is where you turn it in. Maybe it's a Word doc and you just want to have a Word doc open and do whatever I ask you to do. And you can attach a Word document. Sometimes you may need a Word doc and a couple picture docs too. It really depends on what the activities are. Okay, but in some way, prove to me that you've done that. So you turn them in here. You do not email those to me or send them in any other format. They need to show up here on Canvas. Okay. All right, this is something that both in-class students and online students do. So the only difference is the in-class students are doing them in the class period live with us, and online students, you're doing it either, if you're live streaming this, you'll do it as we do it live, or you'll do it as you watch the video later on. So do make sure that you follow through on that. All right, so let's kind of finish up the information on the syllabus here. What's next? Well, the novel report. So This is something that I recommend you start today because you only have 8 weeks to do it. You're going to choose one of the novels from this attached reading list that I have, and of course, read it, take thorough notes on it, and then you're going to write a 2 to 3 page report which describes the novel's major, the novel's, there we go, apostrophe, major literary elements and their effect on the work as a whole. Though not a full literary analysis, note, this is important wording here, guys. I'll explain it in more detail in a second. This paper still requires attention to detail and an application of literary elements and historical and cultural background. Okay, here are the choices, and if you have any others that you're thinking about, and by the way, it will be hard for me, not hard for me, I probably will not accept anything that's not on this list because I want you to read these. These are from this time period. These are some really famous books from this time period that I want you to read, okay? So maybe some exceptions to this, but you need to take a look at it. So you can see the list here. There's the author is listed and then a number of possibilities. In preparation for this class, I actually reread The Great Gatsby. I'm in the process of rereading To Kill a Mockingbird. I read recently The Old Man and the Sea, and I read A Farewell to Arms. I've considered going back and rereading that. And I'll probably read a couple more of these as well. Actually, Call of the Wild's been on my list for a while, so I may focus on that. So this week, this cycle, I'm going to try to read a lot of these books again as well to refresh my memory. So you do that too, okay? I consume a lot of books via audiobook. That would be a good place to start if you have that capability to do audiobooks. And then as you dig a little bit deeper and write, you probably will need a hard copy of the book or just go back and forth between listening and writing, which is a little bit harder. But sometimes in my first pass through a piece of literature, I'll use an audiobook, and then the deeper that I dig in, definitely on a literary analysis, I'm going to have a hard copy of a book. But you need to read the book. Now, what exactly do you do? The 2 to 3 page report, which by the way is in MLA format, you are going to be describing the major literary elements. Okay? What are the literary elements? We're going to talk about that a little bit later in today's class period. And the literary elements' effect on the work. So you'll need to say, hey, here's something that I noticed about the characters. Here's the effect that has on the story. Here's something I noticed about the setting, as an example. And here's the effect that has on the story. Here's symbolism that's used in the book, which, by the way, for Great Gatsby is huge. And here's the effect that has on the book. Okay, now this is not a full literary analysis, or that's what a literary essay is. You will write one of those. Okay, but it still does require you to have attention to detail. Listen to me very carefully. This novel report is not the same as the book reports that you did in high school. I do not want a plot summary of the novel, okay? Most of these I have read. I know what they're about, all right? And even if I haven't read them, that's not the point of the assignment. The point of the assignment is for you to apply what you're learning about literature to this book. So you're saying, hey, I observe these literary elements. Here's the effect that they have. And here are some cultural and historical things that I noticed as well. So you're interacting with some of the materials in the book, okay, in 2 to 3 pages. So that's what you are required to do. This isn't due until the last week of class, if I remember correctly. Let me just double check that I'm not lying to you. Yes, last week of class, okay? Last day of class, in fact. So start now. Give yourself as much time. Do not take a long time to decide what book you're going to do. You know, figure it out. Choose one of these on the list. Don't make it overcomplicated, and start now. Okay. You definitely don't want to wait to the last minute to try to get through this. Okay. So, if you have questions about this at all, please let me know. In class, students, if you want to ask next week in class, that's great. If you guys want to send me messages, I'd be happy to answer them in that format as well. Okay, so this is different from your literary essay. What do you do in the literary essay? Okay, well, In a 7 to 10 page essay, argue a particular thesis about a literary work that's discussed in this course. Note the wording there. A literary work that's discussed in this course. That means that you have to choose something that we are actually reading in this class. Okay? Not your novel, one of the literary works in your textbook. Why? Because we have done reading journals on them, we've done discussion boards on them, and you have done, we've discussed them in class, okay? And so that gives you some ammunition to kind of think through them in more detail, some more things to write about, and now you get to provide some additional research into that. You do have to use 5 outside resources in the essay, and I do expect you to be quoting from the story that you're going to be working through as well. I'm going to spend a huge chunk of today's class talking about this project and how to do it. All right, so if you're confused about this, that's okay. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Excuse me. So I'm going to talk about the research process. I'm going to talk about how to do this essay, okay? This is also something that you're not going to want to wait until the last minute to do, okay? It would probably be okay if you waited maybe 2 weeks to start working on the literary essay, maybe even 3 weeks. But by that time period, I would want to, at the very minimum, have selected what I want to read, and I would be reading it in a lot of detail, okay? So that's at least the intro to the literary essay. Like I said, I'm going to get into more detail about that here in a little bit. All right, other assignment policies that you're going to need to know about in this class. First of all, everything is in MLA, 8th edition. I do want to pause and talk about plagiarism here. Note our definition of plagiarism, and Calvary's definition of plagiarism is not weird. This is the standard definition of plagiarism. It's defined as copying any part of a book or paper without identifying the author. This includes taking another person's ideas and presenting them as your own. That means that you can actually unintentionally plagiarize. If you have not cited a source, you've not provided us with information about where something came from, you're essentially claiming that that is your own thought when it is not the case. Okay? That would be plagiarism. And that typically happens in classes. So make sure you are following the MLA guidelines for citations. As a scholar and as one who is attending Calvary University, who's claiming the name of Christ, we need to follow good scholarship and best practices. That means that you need to be honest about where you're getting your information. You need to consult good sources, and you need to show us where those are coming from. Those are the expectations that I have for you. I will walk through that a little bit more in the second part of today's class, but just wanted to hit some of the basics with you right now. All right. Late work, minus 5% final grade per day late. And I do expect that the work that you're doing in this class is original to this class, that you haven't transported a paper from another Calvary class or another course that you've attended in the past, and you're just turning in that same paper here. Okay? All right. Lastly, you can see the point breakdown of all the assignments. If you want to, be a nerd and look at all the point breakdowns and all of that, I'm not going to go over that with you in detail now. I do want to overview the syllabus with you here just real quick. You can see kind of the general content that we're going into each week, kind of historically this week and next week, looking at realism, regionalism, and naturalism. And then we go into modern poetry for 2 weeks, and then American fiction for 2 weeks, and postmodern literature for 2 weeks. So that's essentially where we're headed. I'm going to explain this in more detail here in a minute when we get to the notes, talking about the major literary time periods and what this class focuses on. And you can see all of your reading assignments over here, along with all of the other assignments that you have. So for the first week of class, I know it's always difficult in a literature class to catch up with reading, so I have provided you kind of an extension on your first week of assignments. So your first discussion boards and your first reading journals are not due until the end of next week, okay? So you actually have extra time to be able to read through these assignments for week 1 and then do the reading journal. But then also make sure you're doing the assignments for week 2 and do that reading journal too. Same with the discussion board. So you just have extra time to kind of work through that at the beginning. But then that's pretty consistent that you have a discussion board and a reading journal each week, and you can see the readings there. And then your literary essay and novel report are not due until the very, very end. Okay. And if you do require any accommodations of any kind for any learning difference that you have, please consult with our Disability Support Services Department, and they would be very helpful in establishing you and getting you the support that you need. And I want to mention the Clark Academic Center is one of the most amazing tools that we offer for free here on campus. You should know out there, if you're getting tutoring or help out in the real world, you may be spending between $40 and $100 an hour for tutoring, and you get that for free here as a student. So take advantage of our tutors over at the Clark Academic Center. They are well trained. They're amazing, friendly, kind people that are waiting and very excited to take a look at your literary essays and to help you with issues like MLA or even Turabian if you're using that in other classes, or APA, or any stage of the writing process. And even if it's not for this class, you're taking a math class you're struggling in, they can help with that too. So any academic area, please consult the Clark Academic Center. They would love to work with you. Okay, so that's the basics of information for this class. Okay, let's go ahead. We're going to transition and talk about the actual content for this course. I'm going to take a quick break here, get some water, and then I'm going to jump into the notes where we're going to talk about 4 keys that you need as you study literature. And at the end of the discussion, one of those is research practices, and we're going to talk about that literary essay. So join me after the break here. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to be looking at key tools as you study literature. Okay. Now, some of these I'm going to have to go over pretty fast because there's a lot of material to cover for today. And I have had to squeeze some of the things that we were going to be talking about in Monday's course to next Monday's class. Just because I do want to be able to interact with those of you who are in the in-person class and go over some of that material. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over all the relevant background information that you need for the study of literature. Some of that information I've provided some supplemental materials for you because it's kind of expected that you have some of those basics as you attend this class. But I know some of you are taking this for a general education elective and have never taken a literature course before, and some of this may be new to you. And so as we kind of transition this into an upper level literature course and then introduce a new introduction to literature course next year, I'm providing some supplemental information to help those of you who may not have some of that background, because I realize that may be your situation. So one of those is your first key to the study of literature, and that's understanding the literary elements and devices. Okay, now I'm providing you a separate series of notes here. I'm going to go over it in just general detail right now. And I know you're going to need, if you've never done a literature class before, you're going to need to go over this information in a lot more detail than I have time to cover right now. So what I'm doing is I'm providing you these notes here. These are my detailed literary element notes, complete with some illustrated pictures from yours truly, just for kicks. as we deal with some of these. So this gets into some more detail, and I'm hoping as well to attach some videos from some previous courses that I've taught that deal with this as well, just in case you need that refresher, okay? A number of you in this course have either taken American Literature 1, you've taken an entry-level literature course, or maybe even had some Intro to Literature in a Comp 2 course before with either Dr. Stricker or myself. So you maybe have some of this background and a little bit stronger in that. So we're going to skim through some of this material, but if you do need to go into more detail, I have provided that information for you online. And I am trying to keep today's video a little bit shorter, so that gives some of you time to go and check out the other resources if needed on that, okay? So real briefly, we break down literature into literary elements and literary devices. There are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of literary devices. Literary elements, depending on the list you consult, there's roughly 9 of them. Some of these they break down, like sometimes tone and mood are listed separately. Sometimes dialogue is included within character. You'll see in my notes, sometimes I do that as well. So some of these overlap. But essentially, these are the literary elements. The literary elements are like the big things about literature that make up a piece. And these are the key vocabulary words that you're going to need to be using in this class. So as we have our in-class discussions, we're going to be asking questions about character and setting and plot, conflict, theme, etc. You're going to need to bring observations about these. And these are the things that you're going to need to be writing about in your literary essay and in your novel report. So this is some core vocabulary that you're going to need. Okay, so what is exactly character? Well, characters are the main drive for any piece of literary work. We always have characters that are present, and characters are taking actions because they want something. So you can kind of think of character as the people the story's about who desire something, and then there's obstacles that are put in their way. That's what conflict is, which we'll talk about in more detail. So characters are wanting something in this story, and we want to know what motivates them. What do they want? Why do they want that? And what actions are they trying to take to get that thing that they want? And so we want to track that in a story. We want to pay attention to those characters. Characters have detailed descriptions as they're presented in literary works, and we want to take note about how they're described. What other characters are they similar to? There's a reoccurring theme in literature of characters that are Christ figures, okay, where they kind of represent Jesus in one way or another. And so you might see characters that have wounds in their hands, and that maybe symbolizes the wounds in Christ's hands from the crucifixion. Or maybe you have characters that sacrifice themselves for someone, even metaphorically sacrifice themselves. That may be a figure of Christ. So there's allusions, references to outside works that come into play with characters as well. If you want more detail about characters, that's kind of the first section of these other notes that you can reference on Canvas if you'd like. Okay, what about setting? Setting is where the story takes place. There's usually a main setting, and there's a number of other settings that happen in a work, especially in a novel. And so we want to look at how the setting is described, but also how the setting contributes to the emotion of the story, how the setting interacts with the characters in the story, and any other relevant details to the setting. Setting is oftentimes overlooked, but it really creates kind of a tone and mood. It almost becomes a character in and of itself sometimes in stories as well. And so that's an important one. Again, if you want more information about that, you can see the supplemental resources that I've provided. Plot is really fun to talk about. And in this class, it's going to be kind of interesting because character setting and plot, some of the core things for the literary elements in the time period of American Literature 2, especially the postmodernists, they really mess with this stuff a lot, as we'll see a little bit later in today's class. But plot is essentially characters taking action over time to try to get their goals, okay? And as conflict comes up in the story, how is that conflict resolved? There's a number of ways to think about plot. You can think about plot from a 3-act structure. So you can essentially break down a story into 3 component parts: basic introduction of the characters, and then the introduction of what they want and the basic conflict. Part 2 is what the characters attempt to do but keep failing, and the story gets more and more intense. And then Act 3, the third part, is the resolution, how that is finally solved, whether or not the character gets that thing that they desire. So that's essentially what we're talking about with plot. There's all kinds of different ways to think about plot, and especially in American literature too. Like I said, the postmodernist writers really mess with plot, and they have plots that really don't follow the normal 3-act structure, or they kind of are more pointless plots in a way. And so what we talk about sometimes is what we expect plot to be. Here's kind of the normal way to think about plot, and then here's what the writer did. Why did they do it that way? Why did they change our expectations? All right. So we've mentioned conflict a lot. A lot of these overlapped. Conflict is essentially the obstacles that are in the way of what the characters want. And there's usually some kind of main conflict that's present. Sometimes we think of this as like man versus man, man versus nature, man versus God, man versus himself. And sometimes you'll have some minor conflict, maybe with some minor characters, but there usually is one overarching thing that is in conflict. All right? All of that leads us to the theme, or what the story is about. So this would be, if you had to narrow down Lord of the Rings to, one idea that this story is trying to communicate, what would that be? Would it be about courage, or little people still matter, or what would be the theme of Star Wars? And maybe we'd probably have to pick one movie here. What is the particular theme? Is it self-worth? Is it finding courage inside of yourself? Well, what about for a particular Marvel movie? What is the main idea that's present? And the way that you address that is actually you look at the characters and what they want, what is the central conflict, what is the plot, and whatever they're dealing with is going to show up as the theme. Let me give you an example. My son was sick over the weekend, and I had something similar to what he had, which is why I was gone on Monday. And so for part of that time, we were watching the Cars movie together, the Pixar movie Cars. Really fun movie. I love the Pixar movies. And so it's interesting, if you've seen that movie, Lightning McQueen is the main character. He's a race car, and he's really full of himself. He thinks he can do it all on his own. And the central conflict is that he's got this big important race to go to, but he gets knocked off course on his way to the race, lost in the middle of nowhere town, and kind of gets stuck there and has to learn how to depend on others. And so the central conflict, him wrestling with trying to be independent, demonstrates the main theme of friends are important. You need other people no matter how they look, as he's really prejudiced towards how other cars look. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. Narration is who's telling the story. What's the point of view? And can we trust the narrator or not? Just because someone's telling the story doesn't mean that you can trust them. Okay. Dialogue, of course, is contained within characters, but dialogue is really important in the story. Especially in this course, we're looking at a lot of short stories and poems. You will, of course, have a novel that you're reading as well. And dialogue in novel, the author has a whole lot more space to have the characters talk. But dialogue in a short story, there's not a lot of time for the characters to talk. So we'll often talk about dialogue being compressed, meaning that the words that are selected by the author carry huge weight. It probably means that the characters are saying one thing but meaning another. It also probably means the characters are saying something and there's actually some subtext. There's something that they're not saying that's buried beneath that. It probably is also dialogue that is a combination of many other things that they could say all rolled into one. And so dialogue is compressed, and that means that on one level it's kind of artificial. It's not like real life. In real life, our conversations a lot of times are boring. They're filled with uhs and ums, and normal greetings and small talk. And a lot of that is stripped away in literature, and we have just the really important stuff. Even if you see small talk, there's something significant about it, maybe even on a symbolic level. So be aware of dialogue. And by the way, just let me take a side track here to tell you that when you see something in a story, it's there for a reason, and it is important. One of the mistakes that you can make as you're approaching literature, maybe for the first time, is to think that, well, this detail doesn't matter. Every detail matters. And by the way, especially in poetry, because it's even shorter, it's even more compressed. So every piece of dialogue matters. Everything is there for a reason. Okay. Tone and mood. Essentially, tone is the feeling that the author has towards the subject matter. So maybe the author is being sarcastic. I should say narrator here, because the narrator may be different from the author. The author oftentimes will adopt a persona, like a character, to tell the story. So that should be distinct. So the narrator, what's the narrator's tone towards something? Are they sarcastic? Are they serious? And then the mood is how you feel, how the author has made you feel as a kind of a combination of the characters, setting, and plot, some of these other pieces that make up a story. How does that make you feel? So that's tone and mood. And then the language and style, this is all of the grammar, spelling, and punctuation types of tools that are used to bring the story to life. Okay, so part of what language and style refers to also how the characters are talking, how the narrator is talking, what time period maybe that represents. So kind of cultural or social or even historical, right? And also as well, what types of sentences are they using? Primarily simple or compound or a mixture? Are they super long sentences? And what impression do you get based on that? There's a lot of different tools that we use in a language to communicate. So these are the core literary elements. Okay, and again, I had to go through those super fast. All right. These notes that I've also posted on Canvas, the literary elements, these notes go into far more detail. And like I said, I'm also hoping to attach a supplemental video from one of our other intro courses. If you need to go back and review, maybe you've taken those courses before and you're like, how do I do this? You can go back in and you can take a look at some of this information. Or if you just want, maybe you've never done this at all before and you want some helpful tools, then by all means take advantage of the supplemental materials. But we have a lot of other things to cover as well, and I do assume that you have at least a basic working knowledge or know where you can find that basic working knowledge. So we're going to move on. I'm not even going to go over the literary devices in great detail here, but they include allusion, alliteration, imagery, metaphor, simile, personification, symbolism, etc. There are a ton of them, and we're going to find a lot of them in our works as we go. All of these, by the way, I'll give you basically teaching opportunities as we discover things in the text, or maybe there's some things that are in the text that maybe we don't bring out in our class discussion. I'll bring them up, and I'll help you be more aware of some of these elements. So we will go back and visit these. You will get stronger at them as you go, but do be working on those. By the way, one of my favorite websites for literary devices is literarydevices.com. Okay, or maybe it's .net. Actually, wonder if they changed .com and .net. I wonder what the difference is between them. I guess I need to look at the .net one. I've been more familiar with the .com one, but regardless, it's a lot of the same material that's been recycled all over the internet. By the way, this is not a scholarly source. We're going to be talking about scholarly sources for research later. This is a general consulting source that's really easy to access if you want to learn about one of these literary devices. But these are not things that you would want to be citing on your paper because you don't know necessarily who is coming up with this information. How scholarly is it? This is just a helpful tool. But notice, look at all of these types of literary devices, okay? So we don't have the time to go through all of them right now, but these are good for you to learn and review and practice looking for And so if you don't know what illusion is, you can click on it and learn about illusion. You got the definition here, and usually they give you examples, and you can even read the discussion, though sometimes that's not super helpful. And so you can use this as an extra resource for you in this class. All right. So if you do have any questions about this, let me know. Like I said, we're going to spend some time as we go over our reading and do discussions in class. I'll pull out some of these, and I'll expect you to pull some of these out as well. And we'll try to learn and struggle through this material together as we go. All right? So your first tool for understanding and reading literature is to understand the literary elements and devices. But your second one is to engage in active critical reading. So what does that involve? It does not just mean skimming the text. When I assign you to do some reading, so the reading that you have to do for this week, if you just flip through the story once, you're not done. Great, I'm glad you read it once. Good job. But there's more to do. Critical reading means that you're reading through the text multiple times, multiple passes through something. This is the same process that I use. You know, if I'm reading something just for general use, like I just want to kind of read through it and get a basic understanding of it, sure, I'm going to read it one time. But if I'm reading something for a literature class, or if I'm studying something for a paper or for a Bible study or something like that, I'm going to read it through multiple times. I actually came across, by the way, for Bible study, I came across a quote recently from, I want to say that it was a professor over at Dallas Theological Seminary, and I'm forgetting who it was, but they said if you're presenting something in a Bible study, and if you're studying a passage and you have not read that whole book that your passage is in at least 10 times, you're not ready to do your Bible study yet. And so that really stood out to me. See, we recognize that sometimes in Bible study, and we don't sometimes see that as we read other literature. Literature takes intense focus and reading through it multiple times to understand it. Okay, what do you do? Well, what I do is I read once through for enjoyment, and then other times for more detailed analysis. I also like to read slowly. Sometimes there's a pass that I may cover over something quickly if I'm looking for something specific, but it's really important to actively engage your imagination. If you're reading through something too fast, like merely just skimming the text, and not engaging your imagination, you're going to be missing some of the key literary elements that we talked about. You're going to be missing some of the important connections. Literature is supposed to be enjoyed and thoughtful, almost like meditating on something, thinking through, not meditating in a weird way, but just kind of thinking and reflecting. Otherwise, you're not going to be getting what they're trying to communicate. Okay, number 3, ask questions. Get curious. If they say something surprising, there's a reason for that. Take note of it. If there's something that confuses you, write that down. If there's something that you disagree with, write that down. Active critical reading involves you slowing down and engaging with the text. What else could you do? You could take notes, and I strongly encourage you to take notes on important elements and devices that you see. Okay, so as you learn the literary elements and devices, maybe you have a good foundation for that already. Great. Start using that as you read through the stories. Make observations especially on character setting and plot, and then some of the others as they reveal themselves. If you're still getting to know some of those, maybe you're not so strong with the literary elements and devices. Okay, then you learn a few of those, and by the way, great ones to start with, character setting and plot. Okay, because you're going to see that all over the place. So make sure you're familiar with those, and then look for that. Write down notes. What are the characters doing? What do I think they want? Do they get that? What's the struggle? What obstacles are in their way? Okay, and again, the notes and supplemental information that's available to you can help you as you learn through that process. And then writing down the notes, by the way, helps you when you come to class. You'll have something to say about the story, because our class periods are going to be a lot of discussion. What did you guys see in this story? Let's talk about character for a minute here. Now let's talk about the setting. What did the characters want? Did they get it? What's the theme? So we're going to have these discussions. So I want you to be prepared for those discussions. Okay? This will also give you material to talk about in your reading journals every week and in the discussion board, bringing your notes and using that to support. So the work that you do on reading now will help you in these other assignments. All right, then Just like for Bible study, we move from observation to interpretation. So we don't start with, well, what does this story mean? No. We start with, what do I see in this story? What elements are here? What devices are here? And then, based on this information that I've gathered, what might this story mean? So we move from observation to interpretation. Okay? And then finally, write about what you're reading. That's why I've assigned you a reading journal. Okay? It's important to engage with something after you've completed it. Not just thinking about it afterwards. And good literature, if you actually follow this process, will kind of stay with you, but to then start writing about it as well. Okay? And all of this, too, you can apply to your Bible study. Okay? As you read the Bible, read it multiple times. Read the passage that you're studying multiple times. Use your imagination. So as Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount, imagine what that was like to hear him there and to the surrounding setting that's described. That will also key you in on important details that maybe if you're reading too fast, you would miss out on. Okay? All right. Now, let's dig into the next key. So first, understand literary elements and devices. Second, critically read and analyze a text. Third, you need to connect the text to major literary movements. Okay? Now, what I've provided here is kind of the basic movements that we talked about in American Literature 1, and then the highlighted ones, number 5, 6, and 7 on this list, is American Literature 2. All of these work into each other. One inspires the other. Okay, so the Renaissance was inspired what came before, and we really didn't focus too much on that in American Literature 1, what comes before the Renaissance period. But it's basically the Middle Ages and the Age of Exploration. But that is affecting the Renaissance, which affects the Enlightenment, which affects Romanticism and Transcendentalism and Realism and Naturalism and Modernism and Postmodernism. Okay, they all run together. Okay, so even if you haven't taken American Literature 1, it is important to kind of have a context for what came when and what was the thought. Okay, so let's trace through this together here, and we're going to come back to this as we go through this course. What is a literary movement? Well, it's simply a way that we, as scholars, we've kind of looked at a period of time and said, how can we characterize the way that people thought and wrote during this time period? Now, it is kind of a sweeping generalization. You can find exceptions to each of these. Not everybody was writing in the same way during the Renaissance or during the period of the Enlightenment, but generally, these are the kinds of things that we find during this time period. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're looking at what was this about. So it's related to history. So we read literature in its historical context. So there are things happening in history that have a huge impact on the way that people thought, which impacts the way that people write. Okay, and so one of the things that will help you as you're reading a piece of literature, and especially you read something and you're like, what on earth is going on here? It helps sometimes to know what was happening in that time period. Okay, so this will give you something to hang some of these stories on. So first, let's go back in time. And for those of you who took American Literature 1, let's review what you learned in that class. And for those of you where you weren't there, let's see what ages happened. Literary ages happened in the past that connect to the course content for this course. So the Renaissance are between the 1500s and 1670s, and these date ranges are somewhat debated. Okay, so these are not hard and fast, and I don't test you on these dates, but this is generally accepted as these time periods. And by the way, I've given you a visual reference list, which I'll be consulting here. Which I think has some of the dates that I've been following for this, maybe not 100%, but you can actually see some of what's come before. And also, by the way, our British Literature 1 and 2 course, you'll see we'll follow some of this as well. So if you're going to be taking those next year, or if you've taken them before, you've looked at some of this stuff from the medieval time period, and then on the British side of the Renaissance, we're looking on the American side, so some interesting things there. So The Renaissance, it literally means rebirth. It is an artistic rebirth. So there was a rediscovery of a lot of ancient documents and ideas from the classical period, especially the Greeks and the Romans. So just think about the fall of Rome and the fall of a lot of the major cultures, the major empires of that age. A lot of it was burned and lost as the barbarians come across, burning the landscape. They're burning libraries. We're losing writings from Aristotle, from Plato. We're losing writings from Cicero. And during the period of the Middle Ages, which is also the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, and is also the spread of Christianity proper, the gospel is spreading as well. And a lot of times scholars just lump all Christian thought together, which is not accurate. But there's the gospel is spreading during the Middle Ages, prior to the Renaissance, of course. And for about 1,000 years, there's this kind of period of scholarly darkness where we've digressed in technology and in literary thought. But then in the 1500s, that is reborn. We make or rediscover old technologies. We rediscover classical texts from Plato and Aristotle instead of kind of the basic fragments that we had during this time period. We find a whole lot more. Something is going on with my screen. I'm not sure exactly what. Hopefully it's not messing with the stream. Give me a second here just to check it real quick. Okay, I think it's probably fine. Okay, so basically during this period of the Renaissance, as we're discovering these things, we're also bringing an incredibly powerful new technology, which is the printing press. And so we're able to send ideas out much faster. This is also the period of the Reformation, as the Puritans and the Separatists are breaking off and challenging doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's also kind of a period of religious upheaval and revolution, in a way, so to speak. And so it's a very important period. So you have a lot of writings during this time period that reflect that culture of rebirth and discovery. So a lot of the ideas from the Greeks and the Romans are re-emerging, as well as a lot of writings pointing back to the Bible and getting the Bible in English and talking about the study of Bible and hermeneutics and a lot of religious debates. You also, this is the period of, excuse me, this is the period of exploration into the New World and kind of the founding of the first colonies. So you have kind of the beginnings of what we know of today is the United States taking roots there in the New World. You also have discovery of new, quote unquote, new peoples, but the Native Americans and all of that cultural influence. So all of that is going on during this time period. So very rapid change in worldview, which then leads directly to the Enlightenment. Okay? The Enlightenment was a period of explosive science and philosophy as the world got more connected and technology, driven by the printing press and a lot of new discoveries just blossomed and rediscoveries. We began to question the authority of the church. And I say we, I say kind of the dominant scholars of the time. And the church here usually refers to the Roman Catholic Church. As I said, scholars tend to just lump them all together. Okay? So I'm not advocating that we should be questioning the authority of the church as well. What they were doing is they were basically challenging the church and really all authorities and basically saying, hey, reason is the source of all of our knowledge. Okay, where do we get knowledge? Well, we can't trust what the church is saying because the church has led us astray and we've got a lot of new, quote, science that is teaching us certain things about man. So it's really reason that is the source of our knowledge. And so a lot of the writers of this time period are challenging that. Darwin comes just a tad bit later, by the way. It goes to about the 1800s. Darwin comes during the Romantic period, but it definitely set the tone for Darwin. Okay, it set some of the basic philosophies in place of moving away from what God says to what does man say. This period also is attempting to make the world better for all people. So ideas of utopia and a good society and we can perfect the human race. All of that is here as well as increasing industrialization, though not quite the Industrial Revolution. We're certainly getting close. Romanticism is a reaction to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. As that does take root in a ton more technologies, writers during this period are still thinking about themselves. They're not going back to Christ, but they're turning inwards and looking at purity from the modern cruel world and the machine of the world. So they're writing a whole lot more about nature. They're also loosening literary rules. So you start to see a movement away from very strict structures in poetry during this time period, and even from storytelling during this time period, because of the way that it kind of seems like an industrial machine. And so let's get away from that rigidity. So let's write about nature, let's turn inward. The individual becomes more important than society. And this is very characteristic of American culture. We're very individualistic here. Very much, it's about me versus some other societies, which are really more about, how am I a part of my society? How can I help my community? And there's really a de-emphasis on the individual. And so that's the Romantics. That led into the Transcendentalists, and is actually concurrent with the Transcendentalists. These people took individualism further. They basically said, okay, religion is not the way to knowledge, neither is really science. Reason itself can actually be faulty, so let's rise to the best that we can be through inner spiritual meditation. And so the Transcendentalist movement in America was kind of trying to turn inward and solve the world's problems and basically transcend society into some kind of spiritual awareness. So you have a lot of stories that kind of deal with those types of subjects. And sometimes it may not even be clear that's what they're talking about at face value. And then if you tie it to this time period, you go, oh, I can kind of see some of that happening during this time. Okay, realism comes out now. So now this is basically numbers 5 and number 6 is what we're going to be spending our time on during weeks 1 and 2. Okay, so this starts American Literature 2. We look at realism, naturalism, and also regionalism. Regionalism is kind of a more minor literary movement that is kind of realism, but looking at your own particular regions. So I'm not going to talk about it formally here, but we'll see some works, and your book talks about it in more detail. So what is realism? Okay, this is happening during the 1820s through the 1920s. It is intense focus on detail. We're attempting to represent reality on the page. Basically, previous to this, stories dealt with romantic ideas, nature and beauty, right, during the Romantic period, or ideas and philosophy, right, during the Enlightenment, or during the Renaissance, a lot of religious texts and meditation. And even our detailed stories tended to have a focus on plot and the 3-act structure, where basically the characters are kind of forced into this formulaic story pattern. But that began to be rejected during the period of realism. Instead, we focus on intricate and psychologically complex characters, and so it's really more character studies than plot. And so you may have stories where the characters are just making these decisions and walking through a story, and it's like, do they want anything? What do they want? Do they actually get it? And it's really not the point. The point is what's going on inside their heads. And so there was an intense discussion on psychology, which, by the way, was kind of a new field at this time. And a lot of psychological practices that we know today just aren't true, but that was new to them at the time, so they were dealing with that. It was also influenced by journalism, which what that means is that they wrote with objectivity and detachment. So if we talk about narration during this time period, we see that there's a lot of distance between the narrator and the subject that they're addressing. Okay, so Ernest Hemingway would be a fantastic example of that. Ernest Hemingway doesn't really tell us a lot of details about what's going on inside the heads of the character. He just tells us this is happening, you know. And so there's kind of a paring down of descriptions, trying to be as real and objective as possible. Okay, so that's some of what's happening during this time period. Naturalism is influenced by Charles Darwin. Okay, so Charles Darwin has far-reaching influence, not just in the realm of science, but every single discipline experiences this. So much so that the word evolution has just become ingrained in our vocabulary. We talk about it all over the place. But naturalism is actually a literary movement itself, influenced by Darwin, but basically attempting to explain why characters acted the way they did. So you can see that there's a connection here. It's connected to what came before. And notice that the time period, too, it falls within the same time period of realism. So this is kind of happening concurrently here. So it is looking at psychology to one extent, but what it's really more interested in is it's looking at the setting. Okay, why? Because where you are as an evolving creature has environmental impacts that change and evolve you. Okay, now that's obviously not our approach in a biblical worldview, but that's how they were thinking. Okay, if we are creatures of evolution being acted on by outside forces, it's important in our stories to kind of wrestle with how is the setting affecting the characters. So whereas in realism, we were kind of tossing out the plot structure and focusing on characters, in naturalism, we're focusing on how the setting interacts with the characters and how the environment interacts with the characters. We're also really, in a way, removing free will. There's also kind of like a just this negative, this is the way life is, and we just got to deal with it. Which, by the way, the later that you go into naturalism is influenced by what happened in World War I. Okay? Which leads us to modernism. Modernism is where we felt betrayed by our authority after World War I. Okay? What does this mean? Well, our authority, there's a lot of different meanings to that. Authority is in religious authorities, authorities in government, authorities in science. Why? Our governments led us into the First World War, which was horrific. Devastation on mass scale with weapons that were invented by the technology that was supposed to lead to human salvation. Again, according to this secular worldview, that we had evolved. We have this technology now that can cure diseases that we couldn't cure before, that can make machines and make our lives easier. And now that same science is turned to destruction on a mass scale the world had never seen before. Whole generations dying off. Thousands of people, thousands and thousands and thousands dead within single battles. Within single, just a few minutes, in fact. Killing on a scale that we had not imagined yet. And we felt betrayed by science. We felt betrayed by governments that would have led us into that. And if you study how World War I came about, and you think, boy, how did this actually happen? Like, there's so many places where they could have turned back and didn't. Every major empire of the world destroyed and fell by the end of World War I. We don't have those today. And also, as people, as we've seen, keep rejecting God over this period, there is also the sense of betrayal by the church, even though it was man who had rejected God. But there was that feeling as well. Religion did not save us, they said, from World War I. Science did not save us. Our governments did not save us. So there's this disillusionment, a feeling of betrayal. Okay? So now there's a further intentional break from traditional structures. So there's more people actively rejecting the church, more people actively rejecting government, and so a lot of anti-government types of things. And within literature itself, there's further rejection of plot structures and further rejection of verse structures. Okay, that's also influenced by some of these individuals. So check this out. So if you took American Literature 1, we talk a lot about Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman there at the end. And these are kind of the figures that we ended the class with, as they basically brought they brought poems that were wildly different from the poetry that we had seen before. Emily Dickinson has fairly highly structured poems, but they make slant rhymes instead of direct rhymes, and the rhymes are not necessarily consistent, and her rhyme and meter, technically could be sung to some of our hymns like Amazing Grace. You can sing a lot of her poems to that, but at the same time they have this whimsy to them where they're just breaking the rules, and she uses dashes all over the place in weird ways. We don't really understand what's going on there sometimes. And Walt Whitman has this life-spanning work, Song of Myself, a collection of poems over decades of his life, and it's written not in any meter or style or meter or rhythm, but it's written like musical phrases inspired by the King James Bible. And so this is very different. And he was willing to talk about really explicit subjects about sexuality and homosexuality that people had not talked about in that way before. And it was very disturbing. And so they set the tone for modernist writers. And so those are the literary figures that we point to. And we see there's this change here, that Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman kind of set up this big change in poetry. But also, look at these writers. Sigmund Freud, okay, basically the father of modern psychology, and Karl Marx, so the rejection of the ruling class and government and problems with industrial societies and communism and all of that, that's coming out here. That's the thought during the modernist time. There's still a focus of man is going to be the answer, like man can solve our problems, science can solve our problems, but there's really a disillusionment to what happened in World War I. But it gets worse because World War II then happens. Okay, a couple more things here too, by the way. There is a focus on the inner self and the consciousness. Consciousness would be coming from Freud, so there's a lot of Freudian writing. So if you want to understand some of what's happening during the modernist time period, understanding what Freud taught, because they're taking those ideas and using them, and then also like what is the self and trying to understand self. One of my students recently was asking me about the English language and kind of our gender identity crisis that we're having today, and whether or not our English genders within our language, how has that contributed it? And I think, the first thing that we have to deal with as we talk about the gender issues today is we got to go to the scriptures. Why are people having struggles with gender identity? It's because they're having struggles with their identity before God. And Paul traces that in Romans 1. When you reject God, you're actively suppressing the truth. That leads into all forms of unrighteousness. And he talks about that in Romans 1. Okay? But here you see kind of some of the history playing out as people continue to reject God. Notice that it continually deals more and more with inner discovery of the self and redefining the self. And by the way, guys, look at this time period, 1910 to 1965. It's been going on for a long time. Okay? Unreliable narrators. Now, Edgar Allan Poe kind of made the unreliable narrator a really popular device way back in the late 1800s, okay? But this comes out in greater detail during this time period. And then look at this, relative truth. Now, relative truth has been around for a while as well. I would argue way back into the time of the Greeks. And you could probably go back further and say, well, Satan believed in relative truth, and that's what he's tempting Adam and Eve with. Yeah, you could make that argument. Okay? But this became more of a talked about thing. And so literature wrestles with that. Okay? Which then leads to postmodernism. Postmodernism is incredibly hard to define because postmodernism rejects definitions. It hates definitions. But we're going to do our best to define postmodernism. First of all, the post and modernism. So it's modernism, but it's after modernism. So it takes the same ideas of modernism and it modernizes them further and tries to move it further forward to the present. This is where we are now. Okay, though some have said we're actually in postmodernism. But the essential characteristics of postmodernism is that it is influenced by modernism, so you port over all of this stuff into postmodernism, so all of that is still true. as a further rejection of authority, anarchy, just self-rule, or social construction, meaning whatever society deems to be best, that's truth. And this isn't new. The Greeks were arguing for that back in the days of Plato and Aristotle, so it's not really new. Skepticism of everything. Okay, so basically we move from kind of like rejecting authority and questioning authority from the period of the Enlightenment to the period of modernism to just downright whatever, man. It doesn't matter what you're going to tell me, I'm not really going to believe it. That's what we're talking about here. So just kind of, it's almost depression, basically. Skepticism, subjectivism, doesn't matter, whatever you believe is fine. No meta-narratives. This is why defining postmodernism is hard, because they reject everything that can say this is the answer to all of life's problems. This is a grand narrative that tells a grand story. And they also reject absolute definitions, which I realize is a logical paradox, but one of the keys of postmodernism is they're comfortable with paradoxes. So if you point out, well, how can you believe in postmodernism if you don't believe in definitions? They would say, yeah, exactly. Some people have said postmodernism is like taking a coin that has either side A or side B and spinning it and taking both sides at the same time. And so you can have someone who has a worldview of evolution and the biblical worldview, and you can point out to them those are not compatible, which, by the way, even evolutionists have said you cannot have theistic evolution. The Bible and evolution are incompatible. And they'll say, I don't care, I want them anyway. It's almost like a buffet. I get to choose whatever I want. The literature from this period engages in fragmentation. Fragmentation essentially means I'm going to pick and choose like that buffet, and it's not a complete picture. And the pictures don't necessarily make sense. I'm just throwing them together like a madman assembling a collage of magazines and toilet paper because I want to. Okay? It's a paradox. And so you'll have stories that are paradoxical or unreliable narrators or downright unrealistic or just complete insane. And so if you're frustrated reading postmodernist literature, that's the point. That's what they're doing. That's where we are today. They try to construct works with multiple meanings, and they reject any single meaning. Okay? In fact, the writer of just lost the name of it, Lord of the Flies. He wrote the work, and then in his commentary on it, he says you can bring whatever meaning you want to the story. I just wrote it, and essentially whatever you deem is true about the story. And that's kind of the thought about analyzing literature that is out there today. That's the way that you'll be taught at major universities. And to one extent, you would kind of expect that from human literature, that we come to it, and it is not absolute truth. This is human literature, so there could be some multiple meanings here. And they'll apply that same thing to the scriptures and say, therefore, the scriptures have multiple meanings, and whatever meaning you bring to it, that's the meaning that it has at the time, or the view that scripture becomes the word of God as you engage with it. All of that comes in there. So it's highly subjective. In fact, I was reading a commentary on the Bible. Basically, it was a book on how to study the Bible, and they were encouraged. It was written, it's a present book, and it was basically saying you bring every technique to the study of the Bible and you apply them all at the same time in a fragmented way. And so when you're studying the Bible, you read it historically, culturally, grammatically. You then read it with a feminist worldview. You read it with a Marxist worldview. You read it with a queer theory worldview, all these literary critical lenses, which we'll touch on periodically throughout this class. And even though those will all conflict with each other, you apply them all at the same time, and the kind of the mess that you get is your interpretation, because that's the postmodern thought. And so there is no clear way to read anything, which leads us to question the very nature of reality. So understanding what we get down to, this is an argument for why understanding literature is important. Because you can engage with the very texts that set the foundation for this kind of poor thinking. And you can recognize that the Word of God counteracts this and defies these types of definitions if you actually study it. And human nature itself, and if you want to look out there at the natural world, screams for order and design. And every group that has attempted to read chaos back into the world has failed. And it's not new. The Greeks believed in some form of evolution. The Epicureans, I believe it was, for example, believed that the world was a result of chaotic, they actually used the word atoms, chaotic atoms bouncing into each other. So it's a pre-form of naturalism, right? Random chance. And Paul directly contradicts that in Acts 17 when he's actually addressing that group of people on the Sermon on Mars Hill. Epicureans are present there. And so understanding this thought, as frustrating as it can be as you're reading postmodernist literature, and being able to dissect it, we can then bring counter arguments back. You can understand how this is working. And then we can also think, kind of on the creative writing side, how can we use our biblical worldview to write literature to this audience that thinks this way, that challenges that worldview, challenges postmodernism? You know, what does that look like? And so as we think about these various time periods in this class, that's my challenge for you, is to engage with it, understand it, and understand how to communicate back to it. Okay? So here's what we've been talking about. We've looked at 8 different literary periods. The first 4 come from American Literature 1. They all influence each other, so you can kind of see that history. So when we pick up with realism here, you can see how we got here. And as we focus in weeks 1 and 2, you're going to see stories and poems that relate to these. And so things that you know about Charles Darwin, you might see that come up in the story. So as you're reading, instead of just looking at character setting and plot, you may also say, where do I see the handprints of naturalism here? What do I see that comes from Charles Darwin possibly here? You know, what do I see about the struggle for free will? Okay, or what do I see about the rejection of plot within this story and focusing more on intricate, psychologically complex characters? So this gives you more things to be talking about. Also gives you an idea of what to write about for your papers. Then, and let me real quick jump back to our syllabus. So if you go to our syllabus here, let's just look at our course timeline. Okay. So we actually will look at modernism during weeks 3 and 4. And then we turn to American fiction. Some of that is still in the modern time period, so we actually spend 4 weeks during modernism, and then we'll hit postmodernism in the last 2 weeks of class. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed. So we'll return to some of this and work with it, and I'll want to hear from you as well in class. What are you seeing here from these time periods? What questions do you have about these time periods? All of that is going to come into play. Okay, so we have so far talked about 3 tools for studying literature. First is understand literary elements and devices. We went over them in brief. I've given you supplemental materials for the rest. Number 2, engage in active critical reading using these things. And number 3, connect what you're reading to major literary movements. So you're thinking about the historical and literary time period that this piece falls into. What's number 4? Number 4 is following scholarly research methods and best practices. So this is where we're going next. I don't have time to film the rest of the video right now, so I'm actually going to take a break here. I'm going to go to lunch, and then when I come back, I'm going to film the next part of this video. So you have 2 parts to this video. Okay, so this is the first 3 elements. In part 2, we're going to go over research methods, and that includes talking about the literary essay. Okay, so I'll talk all about how do you think about the literary essay, what is the literary essay, how do I find sources, and all of that information, and we'll get that in the second part of this class. I'll see you guys then.